There is something about the ocean that has always kept secrets. It has been doing so for longer than any civilization has been writing things down, longer than empires, longer than languages, longer than the maps that sailors once carried folded inside their coats, clutching them like prayers against the storm. The ocean does not give back what it takes, not easily, not willingly. But sometimes, after enough centuries have passed, it loosens its grip just enough for someone, a diver, a fisherman, a historian with a metal detector and an obsession, to pull something extraordinary back into the light. Tonight, we're going on a journey through some of the most astonishing stories of lost treasure that history has produced. And what makes these stories different from legends, different from myths painted over with gold leaf fantasies, is that most of the things we will talk about tonight are real. They are documented. Many of them have already been partially found, and several of them are still out there, lying in the silt of the seafloor, locked inside encrypted coordinates, buried under centuries of coral and silence, waiting. We are going to sail the Pacific on Spanish galleons so heavy with gold and silver that the crews sometimes feared the ships themselves would sink from the weight. We are going to follow a Portuguese admiral into the Straits of Sumatra, where the single richest cargo ever assembled in the Renaissance world was lost in a night of fire and confusion. We are going to drop down into the cold waters off Cape Cod with a group of divers who, in 1984, found the only confirmed pirate treasure ship ever recovered from the ocean floor. We will walk the corridors of a room made entirely of amber, walls, panels, mosaics, all carved from the fossilized resin of ancient forests. A room that vanished from the face of the earth in 1945 and has never been found since. And we will stand on the deck of a ship in the deep Atlantic and look down 3,000 feet below, where hundreds of millions of dollars in California gold is still resting quietly in the wreck of the SS Central America, essentially undisturbed for over 160 years. These are stories about greed and ambition, about storms and wars, about the human need to carry beautiful things across dangerous water. They're also stories about discovery, about the moment when something ancient surfaces from the dark and reminds us that the past is never as buried as we think. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet where history and curiosity meet at the bottom of the sea. And thank you sincerely for being here. Whatever your night looks like, I am glad you're here. Now let us begin. To understand the Manila Galleons, you have to understand the scale of what Spain was attempting. At the height of the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain had built something that had never existed before and has never quite existed since. A commercial and military network that spanned the entire globe, connecting 3 continents through a web of wind patterns, trade routes, and staggering human labour. Silver was being mined in Bolivia and Peru by indigenous workers under conditions of brutal coercion. That silver was being minted into coins and carried overland to the Pacific coast of Mexico. From there, it was loaded onto galleons, massive wooden ships, some of them 300 feet long and carrying over 1,000 tons of cargo, and sailed westward across the Pacific, following the trade winds toward the Philippines. And from Manila those ships returned east, loaded with silk and porcelain and spices and ivory from China and Southeast Asia, making their way back to Acapulco on what became one of the most profitable and most dangerous shipping routes in human history. The Manila Galleon trade ran for 250 years. That is not a brief episode in history. That is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. From 1565 to 1815, a galleon made that crossing almost every single year. And in those 2.5 centuries, somewhere between 20 and 30 of those ships were lost, to typhoons, to pirates, to fires at sea, to the simple mechanical failures that could doom a wooden ship in the middle of the world's largest ocean. The numbers are extraordinary. A single Manila galleon on a good year might carry 3 million pesos worth of silver going west, equivalent to hundreds of millions of modern dollars, and return with a cargo of Chinese silk and goods that would fetch double that at European markets. The most famous of these ships, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, was lost in 1638 on her westward crossing when she struck a reef in the Mariana Islands. Her cargo was so vast that when a salvage expedition finally reached the site, decades later, they recovered over 2 million pesos in silver just from what was accessible on the reef. Divers working with nothing but their lungs and a rope brought up coin after coin, bar after bar, until their bodies gave out from the depth and the cold. And still, they believed, the bulk of the cargo lay deeper, unreachable with the technology of the 17th century. The route itself was an engineering marvel of the natural world, one that took Spanish navigators decades to understand and exploit. The eastward voyage from Manila to Acapulco, what the Spanish called the Tornaviaje, the return journey, was only made possible by the discovery in 1565 by a Spanish friar and navigator named Andrés de Urdaneta, that the winds and currents of the North Pacific formed a great gyre, a clockwise rotation that would carry a ship from the Philippines northeast toward Japan and then across to California if the navigator was patient enough and the ship was provisioned for the long haul. Urdaneta's insight turned a geographical impossibility into a commercial highway, and for 2.5 centuries Spanish ships followed his route through some of the most remote and inhospitable waters on Earth. The journey itself took 4 to 6 months each way, and the conditions on the galleons were appalling by any modern standard. Ships that were designed to carry perhaps 200 people were routinely loaded with 500 or more, passengers, crew, soldiers, slaves, packed into spaces where a man could not stand upright. Scurvy was a constant companion on the long Pacific crossing, caused by the absence of fresh fruit and vegetables over months at sea. Contemporary accounts describe conditions on the galleons in terms that make the modern reader wince. Men dying of disease in the lower decks, the dead thrown overboard while the living stepped over each other to reach the water barrels, food reduced to weevil-infested hardtack and salted meat so old it had turned colours that food is not supposed to be. The chaplains on these voyages kept records of the deaths, and those records, which survive in Spanish archives in Seville, tell a story of mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic by any standard. On some voyages, 1/3 of the crew and passengers died before the ship reached port. And yet men signed up for it, voyage after voyage, because the profits for those who survived were real. A sailor who completed a round trip to Manila and back might earn enough to buy land, to set himself up in Acapulco or Mexico City as a man of property. The officers and merchants on a successful voyage could become genuinely wealthy. The system was brutal and exploitative and structured to move wealth upward, from the indigenous miners of Peru and Bolivia to the colonial elite of New Spain to the Crown of Spain to the war machines of European politics. But it created along the way a genuine economic integration of the globe that had never previously existed. In 1565, the same year that Urdaneta discovered the return route, the first galleon to make the crossing in both directions arrived back in Acapulco, with a hold full of Chinese silk and Filipino gold. The local merchants who crowded the dock to see the cargo were reportedly speechless. They had never seen Chinese silk in these quantities, never seen the particular colours and weights that Chinese weavers could produce with their generations of accumulated expertise. The market that developed over the following decades was insatiable. Every yard of Chinese silk that arrived in Acapulco was sold before the ships had finished unloading, and the Mexican and South American elite who bought it paid prices that made the merchants of Manila enormously wealthy. the story that captures the full tragedy of the Manila galleon trade better than almost any other is the San Felipe affair of 1597, which we touched on briefly in the introduction. The San Felipe was blown off course by a typhoon during her eastward crossing and forced to seek emergency shelter in a port in Shikoku, the smallest of Japan's main islands. The local governor sent officials aboard to inspect the ship, and what they found made them deeply suspicious. A cargo of extraordinary richness, navigational charts showing vast Spanish territorial claims, and Christian missionaries who had apparently been travelling in the Philippine Islands for years. The confrontation that followed, which has been remembered and debated by historians for 4 centuries, may or may not have included the famous conversation about the relationship between missionaries and military conquest. What is certain is that Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan's effective ruler, ordered the cargo of the San Felipe confiscated and the ship released without compensation, and within weeks 26 Christians were arrested, forced to march from Kyoto to Nagasaki in midwinter, and crucified on a hillside overlooking the harbour. The 26 martyrs of Nagasaki, Franciscan missionaries and their Japanese converts, including several teenagers, became an early symbol of Christian martyrdom in Japan, canonized by Pope Pius IX in 1862. The San Felipe's cargo, confiscated by Hideyoshi's officials, was distributed among the regional lords of Shikoku. The ship returned to Manila. Hideyoshi died the following year, and the policies that had led to the martyrdom were gradually reversed. But the suspicion of Christian influence in Japan persisted, eventually leading to the complete expulsion of Christianity from Japan in the early 17th century, a campaign of persecution that the Japanese call the Fumi, the picture treading, in which suspected Christians were required to step on images of Christ and the Virgin Mary to prove they had abandoned the faith. Those who refused were tortured and executed. The Pacific galleons also attracted pirates, of a variety that is often forgotten in the popular imagination, which tends to associate piracy with the Caribbean. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, English privateers, barely distinguishable from pirates in practice, though operating under letters of marque issued by the Crown, regularly rounded Cape Horn and entered the Pacific specifically to attack the Manila Galleons. Sir Francis Drake, on his circumnavigation of the globe in 1577 to 1580, captured a Spanish ship called the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción off the coast of Ecuador, and took from her a cargo of silver, gold and jewels that was worth, by some estimates, the equivalent of the entire English crown revenue for a year. The English called the ship the Cacafuego, a name that polite modern historians translate as Spitfire, but which is more accurately translated as something considerably less printable. Drake returned to England a hero, was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I on the deck of his own ship, and set in motion a tradition of English attacks on Spanish Pacific shipping that persisted for over a century. Thomas Cavendish, following in Drake's wake in 1587, captured the Santa Ana off Baja California and took from her a cargo of Chinese silk and gold worth over 1 million pesos. He reportedly burned the ship after taking the cargo, leaving the crew stranded on the Baja California coast, and returned to England flying silken sails and with his crew wearing gold chains around their necks, a theatrical display of wealth designed to impress Queen Elizabeth, which apparently worked. Cavendish died on his second circumnavigation attempt in 1592, somewhere in the South Atlantic, and his fleet returned to England without him, decimated by storm and starvation. The line between heroism and catastrophe was always thin on these voyages. The legacy of the Manila Galleons is not only material. The routes they established created the first truly global economy, the first time that goods, people, and ideas were moving continuously between Asia, the Americas, and Europe as part of a single interconnected system. The silver mined in Peru and Bolivia changed China's monetary system because Chinese merchants began to demand silver for silk, and Spain's New World silver was the best and most abundant in the world. The chili pepper, which arrived in Asia via Spanish galleons, changed the cuisine of Korea, India, China, and Southeast Asia permanently and irrevocably. The Pacific winds that the galleons followed were charted and mapped by Spanish navigators whose names are now mostly forgotten, but whose work forms the foundation of everything we know about Pacific meteorology and oceanography. And somewhere in the deep Pacific, in the cold, still water below the thermocline, some of those navigators' ships are still resting on the seafloor, their cargoes intact, their stories waiting. If there is one shipwreck that historians and treasure hunters return to again and again with something approaching reverence and despair, reverence for what it was, despair for what was lost, it is the Flor de la Mar, the flower of the sea, a Portuguese carrack built in Lisbon in 1502 that by the time of her death had survived more storms and battles and voyages than almost any ship of her era, and that went down carrying a cargo so extraordinary that the mind struggles to hold it all at once. To understand what the Flor de la Mar was carrying when she sank in November of 1511, you have to understand the context of Portuguese expansion in Asia in the early 16th century. Portugal had, in the space of about 20 years, accomplished something breathtaking and violent and world-altering. Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, opening a direct sea route to India and breaking the Arab and Venetian monopoly on the spice trade that had structured European commerce for centuries. Portuguese captains had followed that route with astonishing speed, building fortified trading posts along the coast of East Africa, India, and eventually Southeast Asia, using a combination of superior naval artillery and ruthless commercial aggression to insert themselves into trade networks that had existed for 1,000 years. By 1511, the Portuguese had reached the Malay Peninsula, the gateway to China, to the Spice Islands, to the entire maritime world of Southeast Asia. The city they took that year was Malacca, and it was one of the richest cities in the world. Malacca sat at the narrowest point of the strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, a choke point through which passed virtually all the maritime trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The port of Malacca collected taxes on silk and porcelain from China, on pepper and nutmeg and cloves from the Spice Islands, on cotton and jewels from India, on gold and camphor from Sumatra. The city's merchants came from 50 different nations and spoke 84 languages. It was, by the accounts of Portuguese chroniclers who visited before the conquest, a place of extraordinary wealth and cosmopolitan energy, a city that had grown fat and powerful on centuries of being the place where the world's traders met. Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese admiral who led the assault on Malacca in the summer of 1511, was one of the most consequential military commanders of the 16th century, a man of fierce intelligence and equally fierce cruelty, who understood better than almost anyone else in Europe what control of Asian sea trade would mean for Portugal. He took the city in a campaign of calculated brutality, killing thousands of its defenders, enslaving many of its inhabitants, and confiscating its wealth with systematic thoroughness. The loot was staggering. Contemporary accounts describe gold in bars and ornaments, precious stones of every variety, spices beyond counting, silk, porcelain, weapons inlaid with gold and gems, and a hoard of treasure belonging to the Sultan of Malacca himself, including a gold statue of the Sultan that was said to be life-sized, encrusted with diamonds, and worth a king's ransom on its own. Albuquerque loaded all of this onto his ships and prepared to sail for Portugal, where he intended to present it as proof of what he had achieved. He chose the Flor de la Mar as his personal flagship for the homeward voyage, and he loaded onto her what he considered the best and most valuable portion of the Malaccan loot. She was at this point already an old ship by the standards of the age, 9 years old, having served in India and made multiple voyages to the east, and her hull had been repaired and patched repeatedly. There were men in Albuquerque's fleet who privately thought she was no longer seaworthy for a long ocean voyage. She had survived a grounding in Indian waters in 1510 that had opened her hull badly. She had been repaired with whatever materials were available in an Indian port, which meant the repairs were functional but not structurally ideal. She sat low in the water under her cargo, and experienced sailors in the fleet noted, without quite saying anything that could be called insubordination, that she seemed to be working in the seaway more than was comfortable, the hull flexing as the waves passed under her in a way that suggested the structural integrity was not what it should be. But Albuquerque trusted her, and he trusted himself, and on November 20th, 1511, the Flor de la Mar sailed out of the harbour of Malacca and turned her bow toward the Strait of Malacca, the narrow body of water between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula that was the first leg of the homeward journey. The storm caught them almost immediately. It came out of the northeast, the kind of violent seasonal storm that the sailors of the region knew well, a monsoon squall that could build from nothing to catastrophic in the space of an afternoon. The sky went from blue to grey to black-green in the space of an hour, and then the wind came, and then the rain, and then the sea stopped behaving like the sea and started behaving like a geological event. The Flor de la Mar, deep in the water from the weight of her cargo, was immediately in trouble. The other ships in the fleet were able to ride out the storm. They were newer, lighter, more responsive to the helm, but the Flor de la Mar, overloaded and aging, began to break apart under the stress of the waves. The hull opened at the seams, those patched, repaired, compromised seams, and the water came in faster than any number of men could bail it out. Albuquerque himself was rescued by sailors from another ship, pulled from the wreck alive, though accounts differ on whether he was in the water or still on deck when he was found. His personal secretary, Tomé Pires, who would later go on to write the Summa Oriental, the first detailed European description of Southeast Asian trade and society, a document that remains one of the most important primary sources for the history of the region, was also rescued, along with a small number of crew. A significant number were not. The Flor de la Mar, with all her extraordinary cargo, went to the bottom of the Strait of Malacca in water that, depending on where exactly she sank, ranges from about 50 to 150 feet deep. Albuquerque survived the shipwreck but died the following year, in 1515, of dysentery and heartbreak, according to his contemporaries. He had never recovered psychologically from the loss of the Flor de la Mar, not because of the treasure exactly, but because of the letters and documents he'd been carrying aboard the ship, the proof of everything he had accomplished, the correspondence with the king that would have secured his legacy. He wrote to King Manuel of Portugal from his deathbed, famously, that he was dying in disfavour with the king because the men he had brought to greatness had spoken against him, and that he was leaving behind everything, his goods, his son, his fortune. He died on a ship anchored in the harbour of Goa, within sight of the city he had built into the centre of Portugal's Asian empire, and they buried him there, in a chapel he had ordered constructed. His body was later moved to Portugal, where it lies in a monastery outside Lisbon. The historical legacy of Albuquerque is deeply contested. In Portugal, he is celebrated as one of the great heroes of the Age of Discovery, the man who secured Portugal's position as the dominant maritime power in the Indian Ocean. In Malaysia and Indonesia, he is remembered as a conqueror whose assault on Malacca destroyed a sophisticated multicultural port city and set in motion centuries of European colonial exploitation of Southeast Asia. Both of these things are true, and they do not cancel each other out. The Flor de la Mar sitting on the floor of the strait that bears the name of the city, Albuquerque destroyed, is a strange kind of monument to both legacies simultaneously. The location of the Flor de la Mar has been debated for 500 years. The historical sources are not precise enough to give a definitive position. Albuquerque's fleet was in the northern part of the strait, somewhere near the coast of Sumatra, and the storm drove them in unknown directions before the ship broke up. In 1992, a Canadian-led salvage team announced that they had found the wreck and had been granted permission by the government of Sumatra to excavate it. The team publicised photographs of what they said were artefacts from the wreck: cannons, ceramics, metal objects, and there was a brief period of excitement in the treasure-hunting world. Then the story collapsed. The Indonesian and Malaysian governments both disputed the salvage rights. Indonesia claimed the wreck was in its territorial waters, Malaysia claimed it was in theirs, and the international law of the sea, which was still evolving in the 1990s in terms of how it applied to historic shipwrecks, made the whole situation a legal quagmire. The salvage team retreated. The artifacts they had raised were seized. The case has never been satisfactorily resolved. The Strait of Malacca is, today, one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the world. Over 80,000 vessels pass through it every year, making it the single busiest maritime corridor on Earth. Container ships carrying electronics from Chinese factories, tankers carrying oil from the Persian Gulf to Japanese refineries, bulk carriers loaded with Australian coal, all of them pass over the general area where the Flor de la Mar is believed to lie, day and night continuously. The acoustic environment on the seafloor of the strait is nothing like the quiet of the deep Pacific. It is a constant roar of propeller noise and engine vibration, a mechanical sea sound that has layered itself over the natural silence of the bottom. The sediment of the strait has been churned and disturbed by centuries of anchoring, by the drag of fishing nets, by the prop wash of 10,000 ships passing overhead every week. What survives of the Flor de la Mar's cargo 5 centuries after she went down is an open question. What is known is that the strait contains somewhere in its depths the remnants of a ship that was, by the standards of the 16th century, the single largest concentration of portable wealth ever assembled in one place. Modern estimates of the Flor de la Mar's cargo, accounting for the Sultan's treasure and the general loot of Malacca, range from $2 to $3 billion. No systematic, technologically sophisticated search has ever been conducted for the wreck. The geopolitics of the region make it almost impossibly complicated. There are also enormous numbers of modern wrecks in the strait, cargo ships and tankers that have sunk in the 20th century, whose debris clutters the sonar and the visual record. Finding one 16th century carrack among all of that would be an extraordinary feat of patience and technology. And yet the possibility remains open. The Flor de la Mar is down there. The gold that Albuquerque looted from the court of the Sultan of Malacca, the statue, the gems, the bars and the ornaments, the accumulated wealth of centuries of Asian trade. It went into the water, and it has not been credibly recovered. Somewhere in the darkness of that narrow, busy strait, the flower of the sea is still waiting, 500 years after the storm took her. There is a story from the early years of the 19th century that reads, from a certain angle, like a straightforward naval engagement. 2 fleets meeting off the coast of Portugal, a brief exchange of fire, 4 ships sinking or being captured. A clean, contained episode of naval warfare, except that one of the ships that sank that day was carrying a cargo that would become the subject of the most expensive and legally complex treasure recovery dispute in modern history, a case that dragged through American courts for years and ended with one of the largest single transfers of archaeological artifacts in living memory. The Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes was a Spanish frigate, a fast, well-armed warship of 34 guns, part of a small squadron of 4 ships that was sailing from Montevideo towards Spain in October of 1804. The squadron was carrying colonial silver, tax revenues from Spain's South American possessions that were urgently needed in Spain. At this point in history, Spain was in a complicated and deteriorating relationship with Britain, nominally at peace, but increasingly entangled with Napoleonic France in ways that made British naval commanders view Spanish ships with deep suspicion. A British squadron under Commodore Graham Moore intercepted the Spanish fleet off Cape Santa Maria, near the southern coast of Portugal, on October 5th. Moore's orders from London were to seize the ships and their cargoes without a formal declaration of war, a preemptive act that the British government considered necessary to prevent Spain's silver from reaching France via Spain. What happened next is contested in its details but not in its outcome. Moore's squadron sailed in close to the Spanish ships and demanded they heave to and submit to inspection. The Spanish commander, José de Bustamante, refused. There was a brief and catastrophic engagement. The Mercedes, which was the nearest Spanish ship and carried aboard the families of several of her officers, women and children sailing as passengers, was hit in what her powder magazine and exploded with a force that, by eyewitness accounts, could be seen and heard from the Portuguese shore. She went down in seconds, taking over 200 of her crew with her. 385 souls were aboard. Only around 50 survived. The other 3 Spanish ships were captured without further bloodshed and their cargoes confiscated. The engagement caused an international scandal. Spain was outraged. This was an unprovoked attack on ships of a nation with which Britain was technically at peace, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of sailors and civilians, including women and children. The Spanish government declared the attack an act of piracy. Britain declared it a military necessity. Spain declared war on Britain within months, which put them in alliance with France, which led directly to the events that would culminate in the Battle of Trafalgar the following year. The sinking of the Mercedes was, in a very real sense, one of the dominoes that fell in the chain of events leading to Trafalgar, the single most consequential naval battle of the Napoleonic era. The Mercedes herself lay forgotten on the ocean floor for 200 years. The site of the engagement was roughly known, somewhere off Cape Santa Maria, in water that is about 1,000 meters deep, but no one made any serious effort to find her. Then, in 2007, a Florida-based treasure hunting company called Odyssey Marine Exploration announced that it had discovered a shipwreck on the Atlantic seafloor and had recovered approximately 17 tons of silver coins, around 500,000 coins, which it had transported secretly out of international waters and into Florida for valuation. The company, which had a history of successful treasure recoveries, announced the discovery under the codename Black Swan. They released photographs of coins pouring out of plastic bins like sand gleaming in the fluorescent light of a Florida warehouse. The estimated value of the recovered coins was around $500 million. It was the largest single shipwreck treasure recovery in history. Spain immediately claimed the coins. The Spanish government argued, with the support of international maritime law and historical evidence, that the wreck was the Mercedes, a vessel of the Spanish Navy, which under international law remained the sovereign property of the Spanish state regardless of how many centuries had passed or how far it lay from Spanish territorial waters. Naval vessels, unlike commercial ships, are never considered abandoned under international law. The crew who died on the Mercedes were Spanish military personnel who died in service to Spain. Their graves were protected. Odyssey Marine, which had invested tens of millions of dollars in the search and recovery, argued that it had found the treasure in international waters, that it had complied with all applicable laws, and that it was entitled to a substantial share of the recovered value. The case went to federal court in Tampa. The presiding judge, Mark Pizzo, was methodical and unsparing in his analysis. He examined the historical evidence, the coordinates of the 1804 battle, the accounts of survivors, the manifest of the Mercedes, the types of coins recovered and their mint marks, and concluded, with the kind of judicial finality that leaves no obvious room for appeal, that the wreck was almost certainly the Mercedes, and that Spain's sovereign immunity claim was valid. Odyssey appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which affirmed the lower court's ruling. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. In February 2012, Odyssey loaded the coins back into their containers and flew them on 17 cargo flights to Spain. The Spanish government received approximately 500,000 silver coins, dating primarily from the late 18th century, minted in the colonial mints of Lima, Potosí, and other South American cities. The coins were beautiful. Large, heavy pieces of 8, some of them macuquinas, the crudely struck coins that were made by cutting pieces of silver from bars and hammering them into rough discs. Others perfectly round milled coins with elegant portraits of the Spanish king. Spain donated many of them to museums and distributed others to the families of victims. Peru and Bolivia also received portions, recognizing their historical claims to the colonial-era silver that had been mined on their territory. What Odyssey recovered was only a fraction of the Mercedes cargo. The rest, hundreds of thousands more coins and silver artifacts, remains on the ocean floor. The site is now a protected Spanish naval grave, which means that under international law, no salvage operation may approach it without permission from the Spanish government. Spain has conducted its own archaeological surveys of the site, and the most recent analyses suggest that the majority of the cargo is still intact, buried beneath sediment in a condition that archaeologists describe as remarkable. The silver, at 3,000 feet depth in cold, oxygen-poor water, has barely corroded. The artifacts, personal effects, naval equipment, ceramics, documents, all the material of a late 18th century warship's final voyage, are waiting under international protection for the day when Spain chooses to investigate them fully. The story of the Mercedes is the story of a shift in how the modern world thinks about underwater heritage. It established, more clearly than any previous legal battle, that historic warships remain the property of their sovereign nations regardless of depth or distance. It clarified that treasure hunters operating in international waters are not immune from national law when they bring their finds into a nation's ports, and it raised for a global audience the profound question of what exactly belongs to whom when the object in question was originally produced by colonial exploitation, when the silver in those coins was extracted from Peruvian and Bolivian mines by workers who had no say in what happened to the wealth they created. September 1857. The gold rush was not quite over. It had peaked a few years earlier. That extraordinary moment in 1849 when tens of thousands of people from across America and from around the world had converged on California with pans and shovels and dreams, and some of them had found what they were looking for, and many had not, and the ones who had were now heading home. The Central America was one of the ships that carried them. She was a sidewheel steamship, 593 tons, built in 1853 and operated by the United States Mail Steamship Company on the route between Panama and New York. This was the main route by which gold from California reached the eastern seaboard of the United States. A journey that involved sailing from San Francisco to Panama, crossing the isthmus by train or mule, and then boarding a second ship on the Atlantic side for the voyage to New York. The Central America made the Atlantic leg of that journey, and in September of 1857 she was heading north from Panama loaded with passengers, mail, and gold. The gold was remarkable even by the standards of the gold rush era. Historians who have studied the manifest have estimated that the Central America was carrying somewhere between 10 and 30,000 pounds of California gold, bars, nuggets, dust in leather pouches, and minted coins. Some of the gold belonged to mining companies, making their annual remittance to investors back east. Some belonged to individual prospectors carrying their life savings. Some was being transported by Wells Fargo, the banking company that was already the dominant financial institution of the California gold country. The total value in 1857 dollars was approximately $2 million, which translates to roughly $500 million in today's money, and that is by conservative estimate. The gold rush itself was one of the most transformative episodes in American history, and it is worth pausing to understand what it meant that so much gold was flowing east on a single ship. In 1849, when news of the discovery at Sutter's Mill reached the East Coast and the wider world, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Ships were booked solid for months. Wagon trains formed on the Missouri River in numbers that the trails could barely accommodate. Men, and some women, though they faced far greater obstacles, left farms and factories and counting houses and law offices and headed west, drawn by the simple arithmetic of the possibility of wealth. The California goldfields produced between 1848 and 1855 approximately $370 million worth of gold, a number that, in today's terms, represents something in the range of $12 to $15 billion. Much of that gold eventually made its way east, in the holds of steamships, in the vaults of Wells Fargo stagecoaches, in the money belts of successful miners who had survived the physical and psychological gauntlet of the goldfields. There were 578 people on board when the Central America encountered Hurricane San Ciprian off the coast of the Carolinas on September 9th. The storm had already been building for days. The sea state, when the hurricane reached its peak intensity around the ship, was catastrophic. Waves of 30 to 40 feet, winds that stripped the paint from the upper decks, a barometric pressure so low that the captain, William Herndon, had never experienced anything like it in 20 years at sea. The Central America's engines struggled to maintain headway against the seas. Then, on the afternoon of September 10th, water got into the boilers. The fires went out. Without steam power, the ship was helpless. Captain Herndon's behaviour over the next several hours has been studied and admired by naval historians ever since. He organised his crew and passengers with calm precision, focused first on keeping the ship afloat through bailing by hand. Then, when it became clear the ship was doomed, on saving as many lives as possible. Women and children were put into the lifeboats first, all of them. The male passengers and crew, over 400 of them, remained aboard. Herndon himself, in a gesture that became one of the iconic images of 19th century seamanship, stood on the paddle box of his sinking ship in full dress uniform and went down with her. His body was never recovered. The United States Navy named a ship after him. His portrait hung in the New York Clearing House for decades, and when Washington, D.C.'s Herndon Monument was erected in 1860, it was to honour this captain who put his passengers above himself with the kind of absolute, unconflicted moral clarity that the Victorian age admired, and that we still find, if we are honest, enormously moving. The passengers who survived did so by extraordinary fortune. 2 sailing ships, the Brig Marine and the Bark Ellen, happened upon the wreck site during the storm and managed at great risk to their own safety to rescue survivors from the water. The accounts of the rescue that appeared in newspapers over the following weeks described scenes of desperate chaos. Men clinging to wreckage, others swimming in the darkness, the rescuing ships barely able to maintain position in the still violent seas. One passenger, a man named Adna Ames, survived by clinging to a floating mattress for hours before being picked up. Another, a woman who'd been placed in a lifeboat with the other women and children, watched from a safe distance as the ship went down and could not look away, could not turn her eyes from the place where her husband and most of the other men were still, aboard. 425 men died. 153 survived. The loss of the Central America had an immediate economic effect. The gold she was carrying never reached New York, and the financial panic that was already developing in the autumn of 1857 was sharply worsened. Banks that had been expecting California gold to cover their obligations found themselves without it. The Panic of 1857, one of the significant economic crises of the 19th century, created a recession that lasted until the Civil War essentially reset the economic landscape of the country. The economist Paul Moreno, writing in the 20th century, estimated that the loss of the Central America's cargo deepened the panic by at least 6 months. You could argue, with some historical justification, that the gold at the bottom of the Atlantic contributed through its absence to the economic conditions that pushed the country toward its greatest crisis. For 131 years, the Central America lay on the floor of the Atlantic, 2 miles down, 200 miles off the coast of South Carolina, in water cold enough that the gold and the artifacts were preserved in near-perfect condition. Then, in 1988, a group of engineers and oceanographers led by a Columbus, Ohio man named Tommy Thompson found her. Thompson was not a treasure hunter in the conventional sense. He was an engineer with a background in ocean technology, and he had spent years developing the theoretical framework for how to find and recover deep-sea shipwrecks using remotely operated vehicles and computer-modelled search areas. He raised money from investors in Ohio, over 120 of them, dentists and doctors and business people who believed in his vision, and formed a company called Columbus America Discovery Group. He built a remotely operated vehicle called Nemo that was specifically designed for deep water work, with cameras capable of high-resolution imaging and manipulator arms sensitive enough to lift fragile artifacts without damage. He spent 3 summers at sea searching the mathematical probability zone he had calculated for where the Central America might lie, a search area of roughly 1,400 square miles of open ocean. When Nemo's cameras descended to the wreck site, the images that came back were extraordinary. The gold was lying in the mud exactly as it had fallen when the ship sank, bars stacked in what had been strong rooms, coins scattered across the sediment, Wells Fargo boxes and mail bags still partially intact, the wood of the ship's structure dark and preserved in the cold water. The video footage showed gold coins lying in clusters on the seafloor with the casual abundance of scattered leaves, as though someone had tipped a bank vault upside down and walked away. Thompson's team recovered an initial haul that included over a ton of gold bars and thousands of gold coins, many of them in mint condition, having spent a century and a half at the bottom of the ocean without the slightest degradation. The coins included extraordinarily rare specimens, double eagles and quarter eagles in perfect uncirculated condition, and their value to numismatists and collectors was extraordinary. What followed Thompson's discovery was one of the more complicated and dispiriting legal sagas in the history of treasure recovery. His investors, having waited years and contributed millions, expected their share. But Thompson, as the years of litigation dragged on, began to behave erratically. He disappeared, quite literally, in 2012, going on the run with a female companion, leaving behind his investors and a court order requiring him to account for the gold he'd already recovered and sold. He was eventually captured in Florida in 2015, after 2 years as a fugitive, living in a motel in Boca Raton under an assumed name, with a large quantity of cash and gold coins he'd hidden from the courts. He was imprisoned for contempt of court. His story is a parable about what extraordinary treasure does to ordinary human judgment, how the weight of it, the sheer glittering reality of gold in quantities that most humans never encounter, can destabilize the most apparently rational person. The story of the Central America herself is something else entirely. It is a story about a storm, a captain, and the terrible arithmetic of who gets to live and who does not. The gold at the bottom of the Atlantic, still the subject of ongoing legal proceedings, remains in some philosophical sense exactly what it always was, the product of an extraordinary moment in American history, carried east by people who had survived one frontier only to meet another. His name was Samuel Bellamy, and in the 2 years between 1716 and 1718, he became the single most successful pirate captain in the history of the Atlantic, or at least in the brief, violent, extraordinary era that historians call the Golden Age of piracy, when the end of the War of Spanish Succession left thousands of naval veterans suddenly unemployed, restless, skilled in seamanship and violence, and possessed of a profound contempt for the social and economic order that had used them as cannon fodder and then discarded them. Bellamy, who was born in Devon, England around 1689, and who came to the Americas as a young man with the idea of making his fortune through salvage diving on Spanish wrecks off the coast of Florida, was one of those men. He had come to the Caribbean with ambitions of legitimate wealth and found himself, through a combination of failed salvage schemes and powerful personal resentment, drawn into the orbit of the pirate captains who were then operating out of the Bahamas, specifically out of Nassau, which in the years between 1715 and 1718 was effectively a pirate republic, a place where the rule of law had more or less ceased to function, and where several thousand men with maritime skills and nothing to lose had created a society of their own, with its own customs and its own rough code of honour. The most famous of these captains, Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Benjamin Hornigold, were active in the same waters at the same time as Bellamy, and the connections between them form a web of pirate politics and personal relationships that historians are still unpicking. Bellamy served briefly under Benjamin Hornigold before commanding his own vessel. He took his first ship in 1716 and never looked back. In barely a year, his fleet had captured over 50 vessels, more, his chroniclers noted, than many naval officers captured in an entire career. He was known among his crew for speeches of radical political philosophy, for arguing that the merchants and politicians and aristocrats who called pirates criminals were themselves thieves of a more respectable variety, using law and social hierarchy to steal from those who had nothing. His crew called him Black Sam, not because of any sinister quality, but because, unlike most sailors and gentlemen of his era, he refused to powder his hair with the white powder that fashionable men used, preferring instead to tie it back with a simple black ribbon. His portrait shows a young man with dark, intense eyes and a slightly sceptical expression, the expression perhaps of someone who has decided he has no use for pretense. There is also the matter of Maria Hallett. The legend, and it is at least partly legend, though there are historical records suggesting a kernel of truth, is that Bellamy had come to Cape Cod before his pirate career, had fallen in love with a young woman named Maria Hallett from eastern Massachusetts, and had promised to return with enough money to make them acceptable as a couple to her family, who apparently considered him an unsuitable match. Maria Hallett, by the legend that grew up around her in Cape Cod's oral tradition, waited for him on the cliff overlooking the sea. When the Wider sank on the night of April 26, 1717, she either watched it from that cliff or learned of it soon after. The people of Cape Cod subsequently called her the Witch of Wellfleet, and some accounts say she haunted the beach where the bodies washed ashore. It is the kind of story that attaches itself to a tragedy and will not let go, and whether Maria Hallett was real or invented, her ghost has walked the shores of Cape Cod for 300 years. The Ouida galley, and the ship whose name is forever attached to Bellamy's, was a slave ship. She had been built in 1715 specifically for the triangular trade, England to West Africa with enslaved people to the Caribbean, Caribbean with rum and sugar back to England. She was a fast, well-armed ship designed for a brutal and profitable business. On her second voyage, in late 1717, she was sailing from Jamaica toward England with a cargo of sugar, indigo, and silver, when Bellamy's fleet intercepted her in the Windward Passage. Her captain, Lawrence Prince, surrendered after a brief chase. Bellamy took the Wider as his new flagship, upgraded her armament to 28 cannons, and installed his crew aboard her. In the winter and spring of 1717, Bellamy and his crew captured dozens more ships, adding their cargoes to the Wider's hold. By the time the Wider reached Cape Cod in late April of 1717, she was carrying the accumulated loot of more than 50 ships. Silver coins, gold dust, jewellery, weapons, trade goods, the private property of hundreds of merchant sailors. A nor'easter caught the Wider and several companion vessels off the outer arm of Cape Cod on the night of April 26th. The storm was violent and sudden. The Wider, close to shore in shoaling water, struck a sandbar and broke apart. 144 men died. 2 survived. The bodies of pirates washed ashore for days afterward, and the colonial authorities of Massachusetts arranged a grim spectacle. The bodies of 6 identified pirates were gibbeted, hung in iron cages, at the entrance to Boston Harbor, where they could be seen by every ship entering or leaving the port, a warning to any sailors who might be tempted by the pirate life. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister, visited the condemned survivors and wrote a pamphlet about the encounter that was one of the best-selling pieces of literature in colonial New England. For 267 years, the Wider lay in 30 feet of water under the shifting sands of Cape Cod, a mile off the beach at Wellfleet. Then, in 1984, a man named Barry Clifford found her. Clifford had grown up on Cape Cod and had been obsessed with the Wider since childhood, when a great-uncle had told him the story of Black Sam and the lost pirate ship. He had been searching for the wreck for years, using historical records to narrow the search area and a side-scan sonar to survey the seafloor. When his team found the first artifacts, a cannon, a bronze bell, they knew they were close. And then one of his divers came up from a dive with something in his hand that Clifford later described as the most significant object he'd ever seen. A bronze bell encrusted with sea life, with an inscription around the base that read, "The Wider Galley, 1716. The recovery of the Wider's artifacts has been ongoing for 40 years. The site is protected by Massachusetts state law as an archaeological preserve, and excavation must be conducted under strict protocols that prioritize the scientific value of the find over commercial considerations. Every object that comes out of the sand is documented, conserved, and eventually displayed. The collection now numbers over 200,000 artifacts. There are coins from 17 different nations, a material record of the pirates' global reach, the places they had been, the ships they had robbed. There are weapons of every kind. The Wider was a fighting ship as much as a treasure ship. There are personal items of extraordinary intimacy, a silk stocking, a leather shoe, a comb, a small gold ring, a surgeon's kit. And there is the collection that has most fascinated historians and archaeologists, the evidence of the Wider's original purpose as a slave ship, found in the same hold as the pirate treasure, shackles, restraints, the hardware of the trade that the Wider had been built for, mixed in with the plunder of the pirates who had taken her for their own. The juxtaposition is uncomfortable and important, and tells us something true about the world that produced all of these objects. In the summer of 1982, a sponge diver named Mehmed Shakir was working the waters off Cape Uluburun on the southern coast of Turkey, a stretch of Mediterranean coastline that has been inhabited since before the Trojan War, lined with the remnants of ancient ports and fishing villages, the stone and marble of civilizations stacked on top of each other like geological strata. Shakir was diving in the way that Turkish sponge divers had been diving for centuries, using equipment that was barely different from what ancient Greek divers would have used. A weighted descent line, held breath, a practiced eye for the sea floor. And on one of his dives, At a depth of about 40 meters, he saw something that he described to archaeologists later as a pile of metal biscuits with ears. They were copper ingots, dozens of them, stacked in orderly rows on the seabed, covered in a thin film of growth but otherwise intact, the ears being the protruding handles cast into the ingots for ease of carrying. They were of a type that archaeologists recognized immediately when Chakir reported his find, oxhide ingots, so called because their shape resembles the stretched hide of an ox, and oxhide ingots dated to the late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE. What Chakir had found was the oldest discovered merchant shipwreck in the world. The excavation took 11 seasons, from 1984 to 1994, and involved thousands of dives to depths that pushed the limits of what was safely achievable with scuba equipment. The archaeologists, led by Kemal Pulak of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, worked in 2-hour shifts at 40 meters, rotating teams daily to manage the nitrogen saturation limits that constrain safe diving at that depth. The work was painstaking and slow. Every object had to be measured, photographed, drawn in situ before being raised, because the context of where things lay in relation to each other was as important as the things themselves. After 11 seasons and over 22,000 dives, what emerged was not just a ship, but a portrait of an entire world. The ship herself, the hull mostly rotted away after 33 centuries, was estimated at about 15 meters long, a coastal trading vessel of a type that sailed regularly between the major ports of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. The cargo she carried when she sank, probably in the late 14th century BCE, was an astonishing index of the international trade that connected the Bronze Age world. 10 tons of copper ingots, over 300 of them, each weighing about 25 kilograms. 1 ton of tin ingots, which combined with copper in the ratio of about 10:1 to make bronze, the material from which every tool and weapon in this pre-iron world was made. These two materials alone, from different sources, the copper probably from Cyprus, the tin possibly from Afghanistan or Anatolia, tell us that the ship was a major commercial carrier, supplying the raw materials of Bronze Age industry. But the non-metallic cargo is where the Uluburun becomes genuinely extraordinary, as a historical document. There was glass, ingots of raw glass in deep cobalt blue, turquoise and lavender, colours achieved through the addition of different metallic oxides, and that required sophisticated manufacturing techniques not widely known in the Bronze Age. There were ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa and hippopotamus ivory, both of which could only have come through Egyptian trading networks. There was a Syrian ceramic jar containing over a ton of terebinth resin. There were ostrich eggshells from North Africa. There were scarabs of Egyptian faience, including one with the name of Nefertiti inscribed on it, an object of extraordinary personal significance that raises fascinating questions about who it was ultimately intended for. There were weapons, bronze swords of Canaanite and Mycenaean Greek types, suggesting that the ship had been carrying goods from or for warriors of multiple cultures. There were a pair of balance pan weights in the shape of animal figures, an Egyptian duck weight, a Syrian sphinx weight, that were used by merchants to weigh silver for payment. There were personal items, a folding wooden writing board, the earliest such object ever found, with wooden leaves connected by a hinge and coated with wax for writing with a stylus, a gold ring, stone cylinder seals from Mesopotamia. There were fishing weights, lamps, ceramic containers for oil and water and wine, a stone anchor still attached to a length of rope, tools for working wood and rope. Taken together, the Uluburun cargo connects the following regions of the ancient world in a single ship: Egypt, Cyprus, Canaan, Mesopotamia, the Aegean, Anatolia, and through trade connections, sub-Saharan Africa. In the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BCE, These regions were participants in a sophisticated, centuries-old international trading system that was moving copper and tin and glass and ivory and spices and textiles across thousands of miles of sea with regularity and commercial sophistication. The Uluburun ship is the physical proof of that system, captured in a single moment, a merchant's cargo frozen in time by a storm or a navigation error or whatever accident sent a Bronze Age ship onto the rocks of a Turkish cape. One of the most intriguing questions raised by the Uluburun cargo is who was aboard this ship. The personal effects found at the site suggest at least two people of high status. The gold jewellery, the balance weights, the Egyptian and Canaanite scarabs point to wealthy merchants or royal agents rather than ordinary sailors. One working theory is that the ship was a diplomatic vessel, carrying gifts between Bronze Age royal courts, the kind of exchange that is documented extensively in the Amarna letters, the archive of royal correspondence found in Egypt in the 19th century, which records in extraordinary detail the diplomatic gift-giving and trade negotiations between the pharaoh and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus and the Levantine city-states. A gift of copper ingots, glass and ebony to the Egyptian court from the king of Al-Ashir, almost certainly Cyprus, would be exactly the kind of cargo described in those letters. The Uluburun artifacts are displayed in the Museum of Underwater Archaeology in Bodrum, Turkey. They are extraordinary to see in person, these objects that were manufactured 3,300 years ago and spent 33 centuries on the seafloor before human hands touched them again. The terebinth resin hardened over the millennia and preserved its shape exactly, a brown solid mass that retains the curve of the ancient ceramic. The copper ingots are green with patina but structurally intact, their cast ears still perfect for lifting. The gold jewellery looks as though it was made last year. The site is not fully excavated. Modern technology would allow future excavators to go deeper into the sediment beneath the main artifact layer. There may be more there. There almost certainly is more there. The sea does not give up its secrets all at once. In the autumn of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers returning from the coast of North Africa stopped at the small island of Antikythera, a rugged, barely inhabited island in the passage between Crete and the Greek mainland, to shelter from bad weather. While they waited for the seas to calm, one of the divers, a man named Elias Stadiates, went over the side to look for sponges. He came back up pale and shaking, and told the others that he'd seen a pile of dead bodies on the seafloor. The captain, Dimitrios Kondos, went down himself to look. What he found was not bodies exactly, but the bronze and marble limbs of ancient statues scattered across the seafloor at a depth of about 45 metres. He came back up with a single bronze arm and the knowledge that they had found something extraordinary. What followed over the next year was the first major underwater archaeological excavation in history. Conducted, it must be said, without most of the tools that modern archaeology would consider essential, using sponge divers with no diving equipment beyond their held breath, and the weighted descent lines they had used all their lives. The Greek government organised the salvage operation, deploying a naval vessel and rotating teams of sponge divers to bring up artefacts from the site. The work was dangerous. One diver died of decompression sickness, and 2 others were permanently paralysed. But over several months of effort, they brought up an astonishing collection of material. Bronze statues, marble statues, bronze instruments, amphorae, architectural fragments, personal objects, and a corroded, encrusted lump of bronze and wood that nobody paid much attention to at the time, because it looked like an undifferentiated mass of deteriorated metal and meant nothing to the naked eye. That lump of corroded bronze sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for decades, barely studied, barely noticed. The museum was crowded with spectacular objects. The bronze statues from the wreck were extraordinary pieces of Hellenistic art including the famous Antikythera youth, a bronze figure of a young man reaching out his arm, whose identity has been debated for a century. And the corroded lump was simply not very interesting compared to its companions. Then, in 1902, an archaeologist named Valerios Stais was examining the artifacts from the wreck and noticed in the corroded mass what appeared to be a gear wheel. He reported his finding, but the scholarly community was skeptical. A gear wheel in an artifact that dated to roughly 100 BCE. The mathematics and engineering required to produce precision-machined bronze gears simply did not exist in the ancient world. Or so it was believed. The fragment was set aside. In the 1950s, a Yale historian of science named Derek de Solla Price became interested in the Antikythera object and began to study it systematically. He had X-rays taken of the internal structure, which revealed something that stunned him. Inside the corroded exterior was a mechanism of extraordinary complexity, involving at least 30 interlocking bronze gear wheels of different sizes, mounted on axles, connected to dials and pointer systems that could be adjusted by turning a hand crank. Price spent years analysing the X-rays and the surviving fragments, and in 1974 published a paper, Gears from the Greeks, that argued the Antikythera mechanism was an astronomical calculating device of astonishing sophistication. It was a mechanical model of the solar system. Turn the crank, and the positions of the sun, the moon, and the known planets would be displayed on its dials. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses. It incorporated the Saros cycle, the 223-month cycle by which eclipses repeat, into its gear ratios. It was an analog computer of a complexity that would not be seen again in human history until the 14th century CE. Subsequent analysis, using increasingly sophisticated technology, computed tomography scanning, polynomial texture mapping, three-dimensional reconstruction, has revealed even more complexity than Price suspected. The back of the mechanism has two spiral dials. The lower one tracks the 223-month Saros cycle, used for eclipse prediction. The upper one tracks a 235-month calendar cycle that reconciles the solar and lunar years, a cycle the ancient Greeks called the Metonic cycle, after the astronomer Meton of Athens. The front of the mechanism displayed the Egyptian calendar. The names of the Panhellenic Games, the Olympics, the Pythian Games, the Nemean Games, the Isthmian Games, were inscribed on a ring around one of the dials. The device told its user not only where the planets were in the sky, but when the next major athletic festival would be held. The Antikythera mechanism is now understood to be the most sophisticated technological artifact from the ancient world, a device that demonstrates that ancient Greek science was operating at a level of mechanical engineering that historians had not previously suspected. The loss of classical civilization in late antiquity set human technology back by at least 1,000 years in this particular domain. The mechanism was almost certainly made in Rhodes, probably in the workshop of a scientist and engineer whose mathematical knowledge was extraordinary even by modern standards. The ship that carried it sank sometime around 70 to 60 BCE on a voyage that was probably going from Rhodes toward Rome, possibly carrying luxury goods and artworks for a Roman patron. A joint Greek-American archaeological expedition equipped with advanced technology has been conducting systematic surveys since 2014. In 2016, they recovered a human skeleton from the site, belonging to a young man, possibly a crew member of the ship. DNA analysis of the bones is being conducted to determine the individual's genetic origin. The expedition team estimates that the wreck site contains a great deal more material still buried in sediment. There may be more bronze statues, there may be more scientific instruments, there may be more mechanisms. Whether the Antikythera mechanism was unique, or whether it was one of a class of devices manufactured for wealthy Roman and Hellenistic patrons, remains an open question. The ocean saved it, in its terrible, indifferent way, and the sea off Antikythera may yet yield more of the world it preserved. There is a small island off the southern shore of Nova Scotia, a comma-shaped scrap of land about 57 hectares in size, covered in oak trees, connected to the mainland by a causeway that was only built in the mid-20th century, that has consumed more money, more time, more human obsession and engineering ingenuity, and outright hope, than perhaps any other piece of real estate on Earth. It has swallowed drilling equipment and pumping systems, and, by some accounts, the lives of at least 6 men who died in pursuit of what it may or may not contain. It is called Oak Island, and the story of its money pit is one of the most compelling and maddening mysteries in the history of treasure hunting. The story begins in 1795, when a 16-year-old boy named Daniel McGuinness was exploring Oak Island and noticed a circular depression in the ground beneath a large oak tree. He returned with 2 friends and they began to dig. What they found, according to the account that has been repeated ever since, was a shaft that had clearly been dug by human hands. The pick marks were visible in the clay walls. At 2 feet down they found a layer of flagstones. At 10 feet they found a layer of oak logs spanning the shaft. At 20 feet, another layer of logs. At 30 feet, another. They concluded that someone had buried something down there with considerable effort and had taken great pains to conceal the shaft. They stopped at 30 feet and went home and told people, and the story began to spread in the way that treasure stories do, gathering details as it moved, growing more dramatic with each retelling, attracting people whose appetite for the idea of buried treasure was stronger than their skepticism. Over the next 2 centuries, a succession of treasure hunting companies and wealthy individuals and eccentric investors sank enormous quantities of money and effort into trying to reach the bottom of the money pit. The litany of those who tried and failed is itself a remarkable document of human determination. The Onslow Company in 1804, which reached 90 feet and found layers of charcoal, putty and coconut fibre before flooding stopped them. The Truro Company in the 1840s, which used a drilling barge and reportedly brought up fragments of gold chain. The Oak Island Association in the 1860s, which spent years and fortune and accomplished little. Franklin Roosevelt, who was a young man, participated in an Oak Island excavation in 1909 and reportedly followed the mystery for the rest of his life. John Wayne, who was part of an investment group in the 1960s. The list reads like a who's who of obsessive historical interest, spanning 3 centuries and crossing every social class. The engineering puzzle at the heart of the money pit is, if genuine, one of the most remarkable examples of pre-industrial hydraulic engineering ever documented. The flood system that protects the pit, if it is indeed an engineered system rather than a natural geological formation, would have required the construction of drainage tunnels running from the pit to the 2 nearby beaches, Smith's Cove and the South Shore Cove, at specific angles and depths designed to allow seawater to flow in whenever excavation reached the treasure level. The engineering is sophisticated enough that if it was deliberately constructed, its builders had a thorough understanding of hydrology, of how water moves through permeable soil, and of how to use that movement as a security system. The question of who could have built such a system, and when, and why, has generated a century of speculation. The coconut fibre is the detail that stubbornly resists dismissal. Coconut fibre was found at the money pit at a depth of about 60 feet during 19th century excavations, confirmed by laboratory analysis as genuine coconut fibre, a material that does not occur naturally in Nova Scotia. The closest natural source of coconuts in the 18th century that could plausibly have supplied a Nova Scotia operation would have been the Caribbean. The fibre appears to have been used as a drainage packing material. It was found in loose layers that seemed to be functioning as a filter to slow water infiltration, exactly the kind of use to which a knowledgeable engineer would have put it. In recent years, the television series The Curse of Oak Island has brought the mystery to a global audience and has funded the most technologically sophisticated investigation of the island that has ever been conducted. The team, working with ground-penetrating radar, laser scanning, core drilling, and underwater cameras, has found numerous intriguing anomalies. A large underground void at depth beneath the money pit, what appear to be constructed tunnels running between the pit and the shoreline. Spanish Maravedis coins from the 16th and 17th centuries found in the soil at multiple locations, pieces of what may be very old human bone, and timbers at significant depth that have been dated by dendrochronology, tree ring dating, to the late 17th or early 18th century, consistent with a construction date during the active period of piracy and colonial activity in the Western Atlantic. Oak Island remains, in the 21st century, one of the genuinely open questions of historical archaeology. Whatever is, or was, buried there, the obsession it has generated is itself a remarkable historical phenomenon. 230 years of people refusing to let go of the idea that something extraordinary is waiting to be found just below the surface of an ordinary-looking island off the coast of Nova Scotia. The very durability of that belief, passed from generation to generation across centuries, is its own kind of treasure, a record of the human need to believe that the world contains secrets worth finding. There is a story from the Second World War about a room, not a ship, not a wreck beneath the waves, but a room that has been called the eighth wonder of the world, that once adorned a palace outside St. Petersburg, and that was dismantled and stolen by German soldiers in the autumn of 1941 and has not been seen since. The Amber Room is the greatest lost art treasure of the modern era, and its disappearance is one of the most tantalizing mysteries of a century that produced more than its share of them. Amber is the fossilized resin of ancient forests, trees that lived in what is now the Baltic Sea region roughly 40 to 50 million years ago, that secreted resin in the way living trees do, and that were eventually buried under sediment and preserved as the resin hardened over millions of years into the translucent, golden, warm material that has been treasured for its beauty since prehistoric times. Baltic amber washes ashore on the coasts of Poland, Germany, Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Scandinavian countries, and it has been collected and worked and traded since the Neolithic period. It is warm to the touch. It glows in sunlight with a colour that ranges from pale yellow through deep orange to dark red-brown. And it was from this material, in the early 18th century, that craftsmen at the court of the Prussian King Frederick I began to create something unprecedented. The Amber Room was designed in 1701 and executed over several decades. It consisted of large panels of amber mosaic, thousands of pieces of carved, shaped and fitted amber, backed with gold foil to maximize their reflective qualities, set into baroque frames of gold and mirrored glass. The panels covered the walls of a room approximately 55 square meters in size, and when completed and lit with candles, the effect was described by visitors as overwhelming. The amber panels absorbed and reflected the candlelight so that the entire room seemed to glow from within, every surface warm and golden and alive. Peter the Great of Russia saw the unfinished room during a visit to Berlin, and was so captivated that he essentially asked for it as a gift, and Frederick William I of Prussia gave it to him in 1716 as a diplomatic gesture. The room was transported to St. Petersburg in 18 large boxes and eventually installed in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, where it was expanded and refined over several decades to its final size and configuration. By the time the Amber Room was completed in its final form, it covered over 100 square meters of wall space and contained an estimated 6 metric tons of amber, together with diamonds and a collection of Florentine mosaics representing the 5 senses. Contemporary visitors described it as the most beautiful room in the world. In September 1941, the German Army Group North reached Tsarskoye Selo. The curators of the Catherine Palace had attempted to remove the amber room and evacuate it to safety, but they found that the amber panels, having been in place for over a century, were too brittle to be moved without extensive preparation. The decision was made to camouflage them with wallpaper. German soldiers recognized the amber room immediately and dismantled it with practiced efficiency. Within 36 hours, the entire room had been packed into 27 large crates and shipped to Königsberg. In Königsberg, the amber room was installed in Königsberg Castle for public display. Alfred Rode, the castle's curator, worked to have it displayed to best advantage. Photographs taken in Königsberg show the panels assembled and illuminated, still beautiful despite the upheaval of their removal. Then, as the war turned against Germany and the Red Army began its advance westward in 1944 and 1945, the amber room was packed up again. Königsberg was heavily bombed by British aircraft in August 1944, and again in the siege that ended in April 1945. The castle was severely damaged. Whether the amber room was destroyed in the bombings, whether it was evacuated and hidden, whether it was loaded onto a ship and sunk in the Baltic, remains genuinely unknown. The theories are numerous. There are claims, periodically, enthusiastically, almost always ultimately disappointing, of discoveries in various locations. A salt mine in the Harz Mountains, a German castle cellar, a buried bunker in the Thuringian forest, a sunken ship in the Baltic. None has been confirmed. Some investigators believe the amber room was destroyed in the bombing of Königsberg. Others believe it was evacuated on one of the last ships to leave Königsberg before the Soviet encirclement. Possibly the Wilhelm Gustloff, a German ocean liner that was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine in January 1945 in the single deadliest sinking in naval history, killing over 9,000 people. If the amber room was on the Wilhelm Gustloff, it lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. The Russian government commissioned the creation of a complete replica, built using amber from the same Baltic deposits and following the original designs, which was completed in 2003 and is now installed in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. Visitors can see it today, an extraordinary achievement of craftsmanship that took 24 years to build. But it is a replica, and the original may be 50 feet underground in a Russian enclave on the Baltic coast. It may be 300 feet underwater on a sunken German ship. It may have burned in 1945 and exist now only in photographs and in the beautiful amber warm light of its copy. The mystery remains open, and the search continues, and the room made of ancient fossilized light is out there somewhere, or it is not, and we do not know which. Everything we have talked about tonight has been building toward this, because the San Jose is, by almost universal agreement among historians and maritime archaeologists and treasure hunters, the most valuable shipwreck in the world. Not in terms of archaeological significance. The Uluburun gives us more knowledge of the ancient world, the Antikythera gives us a machine that changed our understanding of ancient science, the Whydah gives us the only confirmed pirate treasure in history. But in terms of raw monetary value, nothing in the ocean comes close to the San Jose. Conservative estimates put the value of her cargo at $17 billion. Some estimates go higher. And she's sitting on the floor of the Caribbean in about 600 meters of water off the coast of Cartagena, Colombia, found, identified, and argued over, but not yet excavated. The San Jose was a 64-gun galleon of the Spanish South Sea Armada, built in 1698 and commissioned into service in 1700. She was a large ship for her era, a 3-masted vessel with a length of about 45 meters, heavily armed both because she was a warship and because she was expected to carry cargo of the kind that attracted pirates and enemy navies. In June of 1708, she was the flagship of the Spanish fleet making its way from Portobelo on the Caribbean coast of Panama toward Cartagena, carrying the tax revenues of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. The cargo of the San Jose on that June voyage was extraordinary. It included 11 million gold coins, minted primarily in the colonial mints of New Granada, plus a quantity of silver coins and bars, plus a cargo of emeralds from the Muzo mines of Colombia, the finest emerald deposits in the world, producing stones of a deep, vivid green that has never been matched by any other source. The total weight of the precious metals alone was estimated at something approaching 200 tons. The 11 million gold coins in the holds of a single ship. This is a number that requires a moment of reflection. They were minted from gold extracted from Colombian and Ecuadorian rivers and mountains by indigenous workers and enslaved Africans under conditions of brutal exploitation, and they represented the annual extraction of wealth from an entire continent being sent to fund a European war. The British Navy was waiting for her. HMS Expedition, under the command of Commodore Charles Wager, had been cruising in the approaches to Cartagena, specifically to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet. On the evening of June 8, 1708, Wager's squadron engaged the San Jose and her escorts in the waters off the Baru Peninsula. The San Jose fought. She was a warship, heavily armed, with a crew of 600 men. But something went wrong in the Spanish ship's powder magazine. There was an explosion that ignited the magazine and blew the San Jose apart. She sank in minutes, taking almost her entire crew with her. Of 600 men aboard, 7 survived. The treasure went down with her. For 2.5 centuries the San Jose was lost. Then, in 2015, the Colombian Navy announced that it had found her. The coordinates were not disclosed. The Colombian president announced the discovery with an air of controlled triumph. This was a national treasure, a symbol of Colombia's heritage, and Colombia intended to keep it entirely Colombian. This announcement triggered an immediate and complicated legal battle. Colombia claimed the wreck as sovereign property of the Colombian state. Spain claimed it as a Spanish naval vessel, the same argument that had worked so effectively in the Mercedes case. Bolivia and Peru argued that they had legitimate historical and moral claims to a share of the recovered treasure. Sea Search Armada, an American company that had found a promising site in the 1980s, revived its lawsuit. The Caracara nation of indigenous people in Bolivia, from whose ancestral lands much of the silver had been extracted by colonial force, formally declared their claim. As of the most recent information available, the San Jose has not been formally excavated. Colombia has conducted surveys of the site using remotely operated vehicles, and the images that have been released publicly are extraordinary. Cannon barrels, ceramic containers, the wooden remnants of the hull structure, all preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor water at 600 meters depth. The emeralds, if they're still in the site, would be in perfect condition. Emeralds do not corrode, do not degrade, and at 600 meters in cold water, the organic material that would normally accelerate their deterioration is absent. The gold coins, similarly, would be in the condition they were in when they sank 3 centuries ago. The San Jose is a time capsule, a sealed vault of the 18th century Spanish colonial economy, waiting at the bottom of the Caribbean for the lawyers to stop arguing long enough for the archaeologists to get to work. There is something deeply appropriate in a melancholy way about the fact that the world's most valuable shipwreck is also its most contested, that the treasure of the San Jose, produced by centuries of colonial extraction and representing the suffering and labour of millions of people across a continent, is now the subject of a legal dispute among the descendants of the colonizers. The gold in those coins was mined from the mountains of the Andes by people who had no choice in the matter. The silver was extracted from Potosi, where Spanish colonial labour practices killed an estimated 8 million indigenous workers over 3 centuries, numbers so vast that the Silver Mountain of Potosi became, in the words of one colonial observer, a mouth of hell. Whether those facts should influence who has the legal and moral right to the treasure of the San Jose is a question that no court has definitively answered, and it is a question that will become more pressing as the technology to actually reach and excavate the wreck becomes more accessible. The San Jose is down there, $17 billion, by the lowest estimates. The coins of kings, the emeralds of mountains, the remnants of a world that was built on violence and greed, and the extraordinary human capacity for both beauty and cruelty. 600 meters beneath the Caribbean, with nothing to hear except the slow creak of settling wood and the distant pressure of the sea. We have covered the great names tonight, the ships that historians argue about in conference rooms and courtrooms, and the pages of academic journals. But the ocean is wider and deeper than any single list can account for, and before we close this journey, it seems right to spend time with 5 more wrecks, each one a different story, each one a different window into the world that the sea has chosen to preserve. The first of these is the San Martin, flagship of the Spanish Armada. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain assembled the largest naval fleet the world had ever seen, 130 ships, 30,000 men, the accumulated naval power of the greatest empire on earth, and sent it north to invade England. The plan was for the Armada to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with a Spanish army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, escort that army across the Channel, and land it on the English coast. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect weather, and perfect luck. It had none of these things. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham with Sir Francis Drake as his vice-admiral, harassed the Armada up the Channel with fast manoeuvrable ships and long-range gunnery. Fire ships sent into the Armada anchorage off Calais panicked the fleet and broke the formation. The planned rendezvous with Parma's army never happened, and then the weather intervened in the way that the weather has always intervened in the North Sea, a succession of violent Atlantic storms that drove the Armada north and then west, around the top of Scotland and down the Irish coast, where more storms drove dozens of ships onto the rocks. The San Martin herself survived. She made it back to Spain, battered and barely crewed, carrying the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Armada's commander-in-chief, an aristocrat who had argued against the expedition from the beginning, and whose conduct during the campaign remains the subject of historical debate. Medina Sidonia arrived home, by his own account, so sick and despairing that he could barely walk. What did not survive were a third of the Armada's ships, lost in the storms off Ireland and Scotland. The wreck sites of those ships, some have been found, most have not, are scattered along the western Irish coast and the Hebridean Islands, and they represent the material record of one of the most consequential military failures in European history. The cannon that have been recovered from Armada wrecks off the Irish coast, bronze guns cast in Spanish foundries, some of them still bearing the crowned arms of Philip II, are among the most historically significant artefacts in Irish museums. The second wreck is the HIJMS Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever built, the sister ship of the Yamato, both of them the Japanese Navy's answer to American industrial power in the Pacific War. The Musashi displaced 72,000 tons when fully loaded, carried 18-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a ship, and was protected by armour plates so thick that the ship's designers believed she was essentially unsinkable by conventional naval attack. She was sunk by American aircraft on October 24, 1944, in the Sibuyan Sea in the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, struck by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over a period of several hours before she finally capsized and sank. Over 1,000 of her crew of 2,400 went down with her. In 2015, Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder and passionate amateur historian of naval warfare, found the Musashi on the floor of the Sibuyan Sea in over 1,000 meters of water using a research vessel equipped with deep-water ROVs. The images his team released were extraordinary. The massive hull, upside down, the gun turrets partly buried in the sediment, the enormous propeller screws still in place. The superstructure collapsed around the inverted hull like a broken crown. The anchor chains, each link the size of a small car. The anti-aircraft guns trained at angles that suggested they were still firing when the ship rolled. Allen was a man who understood that history is material, that the objects tell stories the documents cannot, and his discovery of the Musashi was a gift to historians of the Pacific War. The Musashi has not been salvaged. She is considered a naval grave under international law, and the Japanese government has formally requested that she be left undisturbed. The third wreck is the Vasa, which is not exactly a lost wreck in the same sense as the others, because it was found in 1961 in Stockholm Harbour and is now on display in a purpose-built museum on the Stockholm waterfront. But the Vasa belongs in this story because she represents something important, the proof that a ship can survive centuries underwater in essentially perfect condition. The Vasa was a Swedish warship, launched in 1628, that sank on her maiden voyage less than a mile from her launch point, when she was caught by a gust of wind and heeled over so far that her open gun ports went underwater. She settled in about 32 meters of water in Stockholm Harbour and was not successfully raised until 333 years later, when the cold, low-salinity Baltic water that had kept her wood-boring worms from eating her hull was recognised as the reason for her extraordinary preservation. When divers reached the Vasa in the early 1960s, they found the ship essentially intact. Her hull, her masts, her rigging, her gun carriages, her carved decorations, her personal effects, her food stores, the bones of her crew, 12,000 objects were recovered from the ship, including complete suits of clothing, shoes, a backgammon board, a comb, surgical instruments, and the tools of the carpenter's trade. The ship herself, once raised and treated with polyethylene glycol to prevent the wood from shrinking and cracking as it dried, is one of the best preserved 17th century objects in the world. She tells us more about how a 17th century warship was built, equipped, and crewed than any number of documents could. And she is a proof of concept, a demonstration that the cold, dark, oxygen-poor environments, where many of the world's greatest wrecks lie, can preserve objects for centuries with a fidelity that exceeds anything on land. The fourth wreck is the RMS Titanic, which requires no introduction, but which belongs in a list of recoveries that illuminate the history of treasure and loss in the deep ocean. The Titanic lies at 3,800 meters, about 370 miles south-southeast of Newfoundland, and she was found by Robert Ballard and his joint American-French team in September 1985. The discovery transformed public understanding of deep ocean exploration. Ballard's photographs of the ship's bow, emerging from the darkness with its anchor chains still in place, and its crow's nest still visible against the white light of the ROV cameras, became some of the iconic images of the 20th century. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the Titanic's debris field by subsequent salvage operations: dishes, eyeglasses, luggage, personal jewellery, banknotes, and the question of what should and should not be recovered from her is one of the defining debates in maritime archaeology. She's a grave site. She's also the most comprehensively studied deep-water shipwreck in history, and the information she's provided about how a large ship sinks, how organic material decomposes in deep, cold water, and how steel corrodes over time in the deep ocean has been invaluable to researchers studying other wrecks. But the thing about the Titanic that most people do not know, the thing that connects her to the broader story we have been telling tonight, is that she almost certainly carried a significant quantity of unregistered valuables. Her first-class passenger list reads like a roll call of the Gilded Age's wealthiest families: Astors, Guggenheims, Strausses. And the custom of the era was for wealthy travellers to carry their most valuable jewellery and portable wealth with them, rather than trusting it to banks or safes on shore. The diamond, sapphire and ruby jewellery that went down on the Titanic, some of it never recovered, some of it at the bottom of the North Atlantic in the personal luggage of people who did not survive, represents a treasure of historical and material significance that has barely been quantified. The fifth and final wreck I want to tell you about tonight is one that most people have never heard of, and that is precisely why it belongs here. The San Pedro de Alcantara was a Spanish warship that sank in 1786 off the coast of Portugal, not far from where the Mercedes was lost. She was carrying a cargo that included, according to historical records, a significant quantity of silver from the colonial mints of South America, personal property belonging to her passengers, and a collection of natural history specimens, plants, animals, minerals, being transported back to Spain for scientific study by the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid. The natural history specimens are what make the San Pedro interesting. Among them, according to the manifest, were live animals including exotic birds and mammals from South America, pressed plant specimens from botanists working in the colonial territories, and geological samples that had been collected as part of a systematic survey of Spain's American possessions. Almost none of the ship's cargo has been recovered. She lies in about 60 metres of water, off the Portuguese coast in a location that is roughly known but has never been comprehensively surveyed. The silver is probably still there, and somewhere in the wreck, if the anaerobic conditions are right and the sediment has protected them, there may be pressed plant specimens from the late 18th century, collected by botanists whose names survive in the historical record, even though their specimens do not. The natural world they documented, the plants and animals of 18th century South America, before the great ecological disruptions of the 19th and 20th centuries, is in some cases gone. The pressed specimens, if they survive, might represent species now extinct or so reduced in number that living examples are rare. That possibility is worth noting, that somewhere in a Spanish wreck off the Portuguese coast, the record of a vanished world may be waiting, sealed in sediment for someone to find it. Every treasure in this story has a searcher attached to it. Behind every discovery, behind every bronze bell raised from the sand, every gold coin photographed by an ROV camera at 3,000 feet, every sonar image of a ship's hull emerging from the sediment, there is a person who refused to stop believing, and the history of those people is as interesting in its way as the history of the ships they were looking for. Because without the human being on the other end of the rope, or at the controls of the remotely operated vehicle, or bent over the historical archive in Seville trying to decode a water-damaged manifest from 1708, the treasure stays in the dark. It is the searcher who makes it matter. Consider Mel Fisher, who spent 16 years searching for the Nuestra Señora de Atocha. 16 years is not an abstraction. It is the entirety of a child's childhood. It is the span of 2 American presidencies. It is the time between the Beatles breaking up and the release of the first Macintosh computer. Fisher began searching in 1969, when the tools available to him were basic metal detectors and diving gear, and he was still searching in 1985 when his crew found the main treasure site. In those 16 years he lost his son Dirk and his daughter-in-law Angel to a diving accident. Their boat capsized in the night, and they drowned in the dark water where they had been working to find his dream. Fisher kept searching. He fought the state of Florida in court for years over salvage rights, Lost, won, appealed, won again. He spent money he did not have, borrowed from people who trusted him, told his crew every morning in a phrase that became famous in the treasure-hunting world, "Today is the day." And then one morning it was. The radio crackled. The voice on the other end said, "The mother lode." And Fisher, lying in his bunk exhausted from years of near miss and disappointment, reached for the receiver and said quietly to nobody in particular, "Put another marker on it." What Fisher found when his crew finally radioed him with those words, 40 tons of silver bars, over 100,000 silver coins, gold jewellery, emeralds the size of thumbnails, was vindication of a kind that most people never experience. He had been told he was foolish. He had been told the wreck did not exist, or that it had been salvaged by the Spanish in the 17th century, or that he was wasting his life on a ghost. He had buried a son in the pursuit of it. And then there it was, spread across the seafloor in the clear blue water of the Florida Keys, exactly where the historical records had suggested it would be. The ocean had simply been waiting for someone stubborn enough to keep coming back. Fisher's story is often told as a triumph of persistence, but the more interesting reading is as a study in what the pursuit of treasure actually costs. In time, in money, in human relationship, in the slow toll of years spent doing one thing to the exclusion of everything else. The Etosha treasure made Fisher wealthy and famous, but it also made him a target. Dozens of lawsuits over the years, disputes with investors and partners, and the state and the federal government about who owned what portion of what. He died in 1998, still in the middle of legal proceedings, still excavating the Etosha site. His company, Mel Fisher's Treasures, continues to work the site under a state permit that requires a portion of every find to go to a Florida museum. His museum in Key West is one of the most visited attractions in the Florida Keys, and the emeralds and silver bars and gold chains on display in their glass cases tell the story of both the ship that lost them and the man who found them. Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic in 1985, represents a different philosophy entirely. Ballard is not a treasure hunter. He's been very clear about this, and has been an outspoken and often prickly critic of salvage operations that prioritize commercial recovery over scientific documentation. He's a naval oceanographer who spent his career at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, developing the deep-sea robotic technology that made systematic exploration of the deep ocean possible for the first time. The Argo, the towed camera sled that first photographed the Titanic's bow, emerging from the darkness at 12,000 feet, was a system he had spent years developing for scientific purposes. The Titanic discovery was, in a sense, almost a byproduct. The deeper purpose of the 1985 expedition was to test the Argo in a real-world application and to develop protocols for deep-water photographic survey. The Titanic happened to be in the search area, which was why the Navy had agreed to fund the expedition in the first place. The search for the Titanic was partly cover for a classified mission to photograph the wreck of 2 American nuclear submarines, the Scorpion and the Thresher, both of which lay in the same general region of the Atlantic and both of which the Navy wanted to survey without advertising what it was doing. Ballard tells this story himself, in his autobiography and in interviews, with a certain amount of wry amusement at the layered deceptions and competing agendas that surrounded what the public thought of as a pure act of historical exploration. The Titanic was real, and the discovery was real, and the images that Ballard's team brought back changed the public understanding of deep ocean exploration. But the backstory reminds us that scientific exploration, like treasure hunting, is rarely as pure as it looks from the outside. Barry Clifford, who found the Wider, represents a third approach, something between pure archaeology and pure treasure hunting, a hybrid model that has produced both extraordinary scientific results and significant controversy. Clifford is a showman as well as a maritime historian, and his excavation of the Wider has always had a theatrical dimension that more academically inclined archaeologists have sometimes found uncomfortable. But the wider collection is genuinely extraordinary as an archaeological assemblage. The care with which it has been documented and conserved over 40 years is hard to dispute. The collection at the wider Pirate Museum in Provincetown is one of the most significant collections of 17th century maritime material culture in the world, and it is available to researchers and to the public in a way that a private collection never would be. The people who search for lost treasure are not a homogeneous group. Some are driven by greed, some by genuine historical curiosity, some by the pure engineering challenge of finding something that has been lost for centuries. Some are disciplined scientists, some are obsessive amateurs, some are somewhere in between. What they share, what connects Mel Fisher spending 16 years looking for the Atoka to Tommy Thompson building a robot, submarine to find the Central America to the Greek sponge divers who stumbled onto the Antikythera wreck in 1900, is the belief that the thing they are looking for is real, that it is not legend, not myth, not wishful thinking, but a material object lying in a specific place on the floor of the actual ocean, waiting to be found by someone with the right combination of information and technology and stubbornness. That belief, in most cases, turns out to be correct. The ships are real. The treasure is real. The ocean is full of it. The technology available to searchers today is orders of magnitude more powerful than anything Fisher or Clifford or Ballard had when they started their careers. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey thousands of square kilometers of seafloor in a single deployment, mapping the bottom to centimeter resolution, flagging anomalies for human review, diving and diving and diving without the nitrogen saturation limits and the decompression stops and the physical exhaustion that constrain human divers. Side-scan sonar systems mounted on fast-surface vessels can cover huge areas quickly and cheaply. Sub-bottom profilers, sonar systems that penetrate the seafloor sediment rather than just imaging its surface, can show you objects buried under meters of mud that are completely invisible to conventional sonar. And the combination of these technologies, deployed systematically with good historical research, makes the discovery of almost any known shipwreck theoretically possible. What constrains the searchers now is not technology, but law and money and politics. The great wrecks that remain unfound are unfound not because we lack the tools to find them, but because the legal frameworks governing who may search for them and who may benefit from what is found and in whose territorial waters the wreck may lie, have not been worked out to everyone's satisfaction. The San Jose is the clearest example. The technology to find and excavate her safely and thoroughly has existed for decades. The historical research pointing to her general location is extensive. The wreck has been located. The obstacle is not technical, it is legal and political. Who owns her? Who decides what is done with her cargo? Whose history is she exactly? The $17 billion will wait on the seafloor until these questions are answered, and given the complexity of the competing claims and the pace of international legal proceedings, they may be waiting for some time yet. But the broader point is this: the era of accidental discovery, the sponge diver who stumbles onto a Bronze Age wreck, the fisherman whose net comes up tangled with ancient pottery, is giving way to an era of systematic, technologically enabled search. The great blank spaces on the map of underwater heritage are shrinking. Every year, ships that have been lost for centuries are being found. Every year, the picture of what lies on the ocean floor becomes more complete. And every year, the stories we tell about the past become richer and stranger and more surprising, because the ocean keeps proving that what we knew was only a fraction of what was there. The story of treasure hunting in the modern era cannot be told without acknowledging the role of satellite technology and computational ocean modelling in transforming what is possible. Before the 1990s, a searcher working at sea had to navigate to a position using traditional methods, GPS was not available to civilians until the mid-1990s and could be off by hundreds of meters in their positioning without knowing it. An ROV deployed from a ship that was not exactly where it thought it was would search an area that shifted slightly every time the ship moved on a current. The cumulative errors could be significant. A wreck that lay 2 kilometers from where the historical record suggested would simply not be found, because the search box was drawn around the wrong place. GPS changed this completely. A ship equipped with differential GPS, which uses land-based correction signals to improve accuracy, can hold its position to within a meter in calm conditions. An ROV launched from that ship knows exactly where it is on the seafloor to the same precision. If the historical records say the ship sank at a particular latitude and longitude, the modern searcher can go to that exact coordinate and begin their survey from there. The area of uncertainty has shrunk from hundreds of square kilometers to tens in many cases, and the wrecks have followed. Discoveries that would have been impossible in the pre-GPS era have become, if not routine, then at least achievable with modest resources and patience. There is also the question of what happens to the things that are found, and this question has no easy answer. The tension between preservation and recovery, between leaving things where they are and bringing them to the surface where people can see and study and understand them, runs through every story we've told tonight. Ballard argues for leaving things in place. Fisher argued for bringing them up. The UNESCO Convention argues for in situ preservation as the default, with recovery permitted only when it can be demonstrated to serve the interest of the heritage. Most maritime archaeologists land somewhere between these positions, arguing that the question must be asked case by case, that the condition of the site, the depth of the water, the vulnerability of the material to natural deterioration, and the availability of proper conservation facilities must all be considered before any decision is made. What is clear is that the old model, the treasure hunter who recovers a wreck's contents as quickly as possible, sells the commercially valuable material, discards the rest, and moves on to the next site, is no longer acceptable under either legal or ethical standards in most of the world. The Mercedes case made it clear that sovereign naval vessels belong to their flag states. The Titanic Act of 1986, which applies in American waters, established protections for the Titanic site. The 2001 UNESCO Convention, even without universal ratification, has shifted the normative framework of the field toward preservation. The conversation between the treasure hunter and the archaeologist, which has been contentious for decades, is slowly resolving in the archaeologist's favour, not because the treasure hunters have gone away, but because the legal frameworks have made their old methods increasingly difficult to operate. And then there is the matter of what the sea is doing to these wrecks in the meantime. The Titanic, which Ballard found in 1985 looking in remarkable condition, with her hull intact and her interiors still recognisable, has deteriorated significantly in the years since. Bacteria that feed on the iron of her hull, a species called Halomonas titanici, discovered in 2010, the only organism in the world to have been named after a specific shipwreck, are eating her from the inside out. The deterioration has been dramatic. Sections of decking that were intact in 1985 have collapsed. The crow's nest from which the lookout spotted the iceberg is gone. The famous grand staircase, which was still standing on its first photographs, has been entirely consumed by the bacterial colonies. At the current rate of decay, maritime engineers estimate that within a few decades, the Titanic will have collapsed into an unrecognizable pile of rust, indistinguishable from any other degraded iron object on the seafloor. The Titanic is not unique in this. Every iron and steel shipwreck in saltwater is being eaten. The rate of deterioration depends on the temperature of the water, the oxygen content, the depth, and the specific chemistry of the local environment, but the direction is always the same, toward dissolution, toward the homogeneous mineral chemistry of the seafloor, toward a state in which the object that was once a ship becomes simply part of the sediment. The wooden ships from earlier centuries are being eaten by different organisms, wood-boring bivalves called shipworms and various fungi and bacteria, but the direction is the same. The window in which these wrecks are accessible and intelligible is finite. It is measured in centuries for wooden ships in cold water, decades for iron ships in warm water. The clock is ticking on all of them, and the question of what to do, excavate now, conserve in place, monitor and let nature take its course, is not a theoretical one. It is urgent. The last thing I want to say before we close tonight is something about the nature of treasure itself. We have been using the word all evening in its most obvious sense. Gold, silver, emeralds, coins, the material wealth of dead empires measured in billions of contemporary dollars. And those things are real treasure. There is no question about it. The scale of what lies on the ocean floor in terms of raw precious metal is staggering, and the human stories attached to those objects are extraordinary. But the non-material treasures in these stories are equally important, and in many cases more important to the long-term understanding of the human past. The Antikythera mechanism is worth essentially nothing as a raw material. It is corroded bronze, damaged, incomplete. As an artifact, as a document of what ancient Greek science could achieve, it is priceless. The Ulubaran cargo is worth a great deal as a material assemblage. The raw metals, the glass, the ivory, the gold jewellery, but its value as a historical document is incalculably greater than its commercial value. The Ouida artifacts are worth money on the collector market, but what makes them important is what they tell us about the lives of the men who owned them, the world they came from, the economic and social structures that produced both the pirates and the conditions that made piracy an attractive option for thousands of men in the early 18th century. Treasure, in this broader sense, is any object that connects us to a human story that we would otherwise not know. The surgeon's kit from the Ouida tells us that there was a surgeon on the ship, that the pirates cared about their health, that they had the organisational capacity to employ a medical professional. The folding writing board from the Ulubaran tells us that someone on that ship was literate, that they had occasion to write things down, that the commercial world of the Bronze Age generated enough paperwork to make a portable writing surface worth carrying across the Mediterranean. The leg bone in the silk stocking from the Ouida tells us that someone wore silk stockings, that fabric could survive 3 centuries underwater in certain conditions, that even pirates maintained a certain standard of personal dress. These details matter. They are the texture of the past, the granular reality of lives that were being lived while history was happening around them, and they survive only because the ocean kept them. The ocean, which has been the medium of human connection and human destruction for as long as there have been humans, is also the world's greatest custodian of human memory. It keeps things that nothing else would keep, in conditions that nothing else could replicate, for timescales that nothing else could provide. And when we reach down into it and pull something up, we are not just recovering an object, we are recovering a piece of the story of who we are and how we got here, told by the things themselves rather than by the people who made them. That is worth searching for. That is worth the 16 years and the legal battles and the obsession and the grief and the extraordinary engineering and the careful excavation and the patient conservation. That is worth every single hour of this long night we have spent together, following the trail of gold and silver and amber and bronze through the centuries across the oceans down into the dark. The ocean remembers, and so should we. There is a particular kind of person who becomes a treasure hunter, and it is worth spending some time understanding who they are, not the cartoon version, the greedy adventurer seeking quick riches, but the real human beings who have devoted years, decades, entire lifetimes to the pursuit of things lost beneath the water. because their stories illuminate something true about the nature of obsession, about the relationship between human beings and the past, and about what it actually costs to pull something ancient back from the dark. Mel Fisher was already in his 40s when he found the first clue that the Nuestra Señora de Atocha might be where he thought it was. He'd been searching the waters off the Florida Keys for years by then, not with the casual interest of a weekend hobbyist, but with the kind of complete consuming commitment that reshapes a life around a single purpose. He had sold his dive shop. He'd taken out loans against everything he owned. He'd recruited his wife Dolores and his children into the search, turning the hunt into a family enterprise that ran on equal parts hope and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The Fisher family lived aboard their search vessel for long stretches. They ate simple food, worked brutal hours, and came up empty season after season, while the banks that held their loans grew impatient, and the investors who had funded the search began to ask uncomfortable questions about timelines and returns. In June of 1971, Mel's son Dirk found a gold bar in the shallow water off the Marquesas Keys, proof that the Atocha was in the area, but not enough to locate the main wreck. The search continued. In July of 1975, Dirk Fisher and his wife Angel were sleeping aboard the search vessel Northwind when the boat's hull failed and she capsized. Dirk, Angel and one other crew member drowned. Mel Fisher buried his son and daughter-in-law and went back to work the following week. It is difficult to know what to make of that kind of commitment, whether it is heroic or compulsive, a tribute to the dead or an escape from grief. Mel himself spoke about it rarely and obliquely, in the way that people speak about things that are too large to examine directly. He had a phrase that he used with his crew every morning, a kind of ritual affirmation against discouragement. Today's the day. And on July 20th, 1985, after 16 years of searching, and after losing a son and a daughter-in-law to the sea, it was. The mother lode of the Atocha came up in 47 feet of water, not the dramatic deep water discovery that treasure hunters tend to imagine, but a shallow, silty, current-swept expanse of seabed that had required thousands of hours of methodical excavation to reveal its secrets. What the Fisher team found that July morning was a field of silver bars stretching across the seafloor in every direction. Over 1,000 silver ingots, stacked and scattered where the ship's hull had finally disintegrated and deposited its contents across the bottom. There were gold chains of the kind worn by wealthy merchants as both adornment and portable wealth, each link a standardized weight that could be bitten off and used as currency. There were emeralds from Colombia, still set in gold mountings, their green fire undimmed by 3.5 centuries in salt water. There were coins in the millions, and weapons and navigational instruments, and personal possessions so intimate. A rosary, a signet ring, a silver fork with someone's initials, that they made the distance of 350 years seem suddenly very small. Mel Fisher's recovery of the Atocha changed the legal landscape of treasure hunting in the United States in ways that are still being felt today. His litigation against the state of Florida, which claimed ownership of the wreck on the grounds that it lay in Florida waters, eventually went to the United States Supreme Court, which ruled in Fisher's favor on the principle of admiralty law, the law of salvage that has governed maritime finds for centuries. The decision established that private salvors could claim ownership of wrecks in international and federal waters, a ruling that treasure hunters cheered and archaeologists mourned, because it meant that commercially valuable wrecks could be excavated for profit rather than for knowledge, with artifacts potentially scattered to private collections rather than preserved in context for study. The debate between treasure hunters and maritime archaeologists is one of the most genuinely complex and emotionally charged disputes in the field of cultural heritage, and it does not resolve neatly in either direction. The treasure hunters point out, with some justice, that many of the most significant discoveries in maritime archaeology have been made by private individuals with commercial motivations, not by academic institutions with government funding. Mel Fisher found the Atocha. Barry Clifford found the Wider. The Titanic was found by a private expedition with corporate backing, even though Bob Ballard himself was working under a contract with the US Navy. Commercial treasure hunters, the argument goes, have the financial resources and the motivation to search in places where academic archaeologists, constrained by grant cycles and institutional priorities, would never look. The archaeologists respond, also with considerable justice, that commercially motivated salvage is, in practice, often destructive. When the goal is to maximize the value of recoverable artifacts, there is a powerful incentive to move quickly rather than carefully, to extract the objects that have commercial value while leaving behind the context, the spatial relationships between objects, the sedimentary layers, the fragile organic materials that gives those objects their historical meaning. A gold coin extracted by a treasure hunter and sold at auction tells you that someone was carrying gold coins in the 16th century. A gold coin excavated by an archaeologist who has documented its exact position in relation to the ship's hull, the surrounding artifacts and the sediment layers tells you how the ship was loaded, what social class its owner belonged to, what trade routes it travelled, and potentially who was carrying it and why. The difference between these two outcomes is the difference between a curio and a document. Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic in 1985 and the Bismarck in 1989, and who has located more significant wrecks than arguably any other person alive, has argued consistently for what he calls leave it in place, the principle that the best way to preserve a historically significant wreck is to document it with photography and remote sensing and leave it exactly where it is, undisturbed, for future generations whose technology will allow them to extract more information from it than we currently can. The ocean, Ballard argues, is the best museum in the world because it is cold and dark and oxygen poor at depth, which means it preserves organic materials, wood, rope, cloth, leather, that would decay almost immediately in any terrestrial environment. Every time a wreck is disturbed, even by a well-intentioned excavation, something irreplaceable is lost. The tension between these two philosophies, between the treasure hunters find it and raise it, and the archaeologists leave it and study it, is at the heart of almost every major maritime discovery story. And it is, in the end, a tension that reflects something deep about the human relationship with the past, the desire to possess it versus the desire to understand it, the impulse to bring the lost thing back into the present versus the recognition that its meaning is inseparable from where it has been and how it came to rest. There, John Chatterton and Richie Kohler, the two recreational divers who spent a decade identifying the mystery U-boat that New Jersey fishermen had been snagging their nets on since 1991, represent a different kind of treasure hunter, one whose currency was not gold but knowledge. The U-boat, which they eventually identified as U-869, a Type 9C submarine that had been recorded as sunk off Gibraltar in 1944, but that was actually lying 60 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, about 60 miles off the New Jersey coast, had taken all 60 members of her crew down with her. Getting inside her, which required squeezing through collapsed bulkheads in zero visibility, navigating spaces designed for men much smaller than American recreational divers, and managing the physiological effects of breathing trimix gas at depth for extended periods, was extraordinarily dangerous. 3 divers died on the wreck before Chatterton and Kohler finally identified her. What drove them was not money. There was no treasure in a wartime submarine, or at least not treasure in the conventional sense. What drove them was the same thing that has driven every serious wreck hunter: the need to know. The U-boat had a story, had a crew, had family somewhere who had spent decades not knowing exactly where or how, Their fathers and brothers and husbands had died. Identifying the wreck meant giving those families a location, a certainty, a grave they could visit in imagination if not in person. When Chatterton finally surfaced with a piece of equipment that bore the U-boat's number, he held it in his hands for a long moment before saying anything. He knew what it meant. It meant that 60 men had died in that boat, in the dark, at the bottom of the ocean, 60 miles from the coast of New Jersey, in waters they had probably never expected to enter. And now their story could be told. This, in the end, is what all of these searches are really about, not the gold, not the emeralds, not the market value of 16th century Spanish silver. They're about the stories. They're about the human desire to know what happened, to recover the narrative that the ocean took when it closed over those ships and their crews and their cargoes. The treasure is real, and its material value is real, and the economic incentives that drive the search are real. But beneath all of that, in the oldest and deepest layer of motivation, what the treasure hunters are really looking for is something that cannot be assayed or auctioned. The moment of contact with the past, the sudden collapse of centuries, the recognition that the people who sailed those ships and stacked those coins and wore those rings were as real as we are, with the same fears and hopes and the same inability to see what was coming.